Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me back today. Thanks to everyone who does so much fantastic work to organize these each week. Particularly thank you to Daughters of the Drum. It was so wonderful to come into the sanctuary this morning and see them here. Just warms my heart, and I'm sure does the same for all of you. One of the reasons I was particularly keen to come back and give a homily today was just to be back in the sanctuary. I know for a lot of us, we've not been here, myself, this is the first time for almost a year. And it's been wonderful to be able to follow the sermons each week with Emily and my children at home, but to be in this space, I'm sure all of you who are familiar with it and are used to coming here each week, we all miss it very, very much, and we're looking forward to being back again. I'm going to do a little bit of a different talk today. I was reading mine over this morning, and I realized when I was doing it that I was being particularly and maybe a little bit too focused on keeping it as short as possible. So it ended up being a little bit shorter than I thought it was going to be. So I am going to make a few pauses as we go along and extemporize a little bit more than I usually do, but I think that's a good thing because it does change up the way you're giving a presentation. But I do have my timer, so for those that are watching, don't worry. I won't go on for too long. We all have our shortcomings, but one of the things I truly admire about Unitarians is your willingness to be made uncomfortable. This is my third homily here at the church. For those of you who have not heard me previously, you will not be surprised that once again I strive to take you out of your comfort zone, to ask tough questions we all need to consider if real, meaningful change is going to happen. Thank you for listening. Let me start with Bill C-15, the federal government's proposed legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Is this a real game changer? I have my doubts. First, Bill C-15 focuses on high-level aspirational commitments rather than on delivering concrete, immediate change to Indigenous peoples. The federal government's focus on future promises conveniently allows it to sidestep the realities that Indigenous people face on a daily basis. And just as an aside on that, for those that have been following it, the boiled water advisories across the country, First Nations who don't even have proper accessible drinking water, is one of the things that comes to mind right off the top. It's a shame for all of Canada. The federal government's poor promises on Indigenous people like winter rain. Rather than witnessing real change, we are too often left with cold disappointment. Maybe it'll be different this time. But if the experience of British Columbia's UNDRIP legislation is any predictor, we should all dress accordingly. Despite the legislation, the BC provincial government persists in its dreary, self-serving narrative based on the denial of Indigenous rights. A case in point has been the province's abysmal response to the attempts by the Wet'suwet'en to protect their land and waters from the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Rather than using its UNDRIP legislation as a tool to resolve conflict in a way that respects Indigenous rights, the provincial government has chosen to disregard its own law. All indicators are that the federal government intends to take a similar approach. Lofty promises followed by the continuation of the grim reality of denial and oppression. If so, rather than delivering results, Bill C-15 will sow further cynicism. And as an aside on this, cynicism, I think, is one of our greatest risks. I work with Indigenous peoples all across the country. I see so many of them who get involved or hopeful that what they're working on will actually lead to the recognition of their rights. And then when they get involved more and more and more, see the response from government, it's hard for them to not grow cynical. And that's why those hollow promises are such a danger, not just to Indigenous people, but to all of Canada. The second and more fundamental reason for my questions about Bill C-15 is that the lack of respect for Indigenous rights in Canada is not due to an absence of legal obligations. It is the federal and provincial government's refusal to fulfill those obligations. Given Canada's long history of failing to live up to its well-established and clear domestic legal standards, why should Indigenous people expect the federal government to suddenly change colors when it comes to respecting international law? And this is one of the things that I hear the most when I travel across the country. Of course, I'm not now with the pandemic, but up until last year, as my family knows, I make 150 flights a year. And one of the things that I hear the most from my clients and Indigenous people in general, why doesn't government follow their own laws? That's what we need. The measure for real change is concrete, on-the-ground implementation and respect for Indigenous people's inherent and constitutional rights. Not another set of commitments to do something in the future. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the passage of Bill C-15 will peel back the clouds and the sun will shine. Personally, I'm not putting away my raincoat just yet. Rather than piling on promises, a fundamental rethink is needed to save Canada's reconciliation project from being an ongoing massive failure. Reconciliation as a massive failure, I want you all to know, I got that from Anishinaabe comedian Ryan McMahon, who, if you don't follow Ryan, I urge you all, follow Ryan's podcast. He's got Red Man Laughing, Canada Land, his series on Thunder Bay. If you really want to be informed outside of the mainstream media, I can think of a few people better positioned to do that with insight, intelligence, wit, humor than Ryan McMahon. To begin with, Canadians need to recognize that reconciliation in Canada rests on a foundation of systemic racism. It is predicated on the denial of Indigenous people's inherent rights and the willingness of the Canadian state to use violence to suppress the exercise of Indigenous rights. At a fundamental level, reconciliation continues to fail because it attempts the impossible. The reconciliation of a right with a lie. The right is the pre-existing interest of Indigenous peoples have in their land and the right to make decisions about their land. The lie is that through simply showing up and planting a flag, European nations acquired an interest in Indigenous land and displaced Indigenous laws. In Canada, this law is referred to as the assertion of Crown sovereignty. In the rest of the world, it's a racist principle labeled the doctrine of discovery. I wrote a piece on this for the Canadian Bar Association last summer. I was surprised how many lawyers across the country and academics I had write to me, basically saying, Bruce, what are you talking about? We don't have the doctrine of discovery in Canada. Wake up. It was codified as a part of Canadian law in the 1990s, but its rationale is not new for Indigenous people. By then it had become all too familiar. For decades and generations, they have been faced with the denial of their laws, of their title to the land, of the true spirit and intent of treaties, of their very humanity. Denial is the handmaiden of violence. When grainy images hover on TVs and computer screens of Indigenous people assaulted by agents of the Canadian state, the legacy and modern reality of denial upsets smug complacency. In that discomfort, the opportunity for real reconciliation is born. And I can't emphasize how important it is to allow yourself to be uncomfortable and to deal with that discomfort. I know I've given a few talks here at the Unitarian Church in Vancouver. I've had members of the congregation come up to me afterwards, and in those conversations I could see their real existential discomfort. Well, that's a start. Those are hard conversations, but we need to have them. We need to be willing to have them. Confronted with this reality of systemic racism, Canadians will hopefully start to demand deliverables. What are the courts and mainstream politicians doing to undo hundreds of years of violence and denial? What is being done to ensure that Indigenous laws are respected, that Indigenous peoples benefit from their lands, and are actively involved in deciding how their lands are used? Asking these hard questions about Canada's reconciliation project leads to an invitation. It is an invitation to Canadians to take the first step on what will undoubtedly be a long and difficult road. The first step is acceptance. Acceptance that Canada is fundamentally a racist state. Let me repeat that. Acceptance that Canada is fundamentally a racist state that has been built on the denial of Indigenous peoples' rights and humanity. That this denial is a shameful fact that runs through and binds together Canadian history and law. Many non-Indigenous Canadians have a hard time to hear those words. I get it all the time. It doesn't fit with their understanding, what they've been taught. It doesn't fit with their own personal history. I think that's part of the challenge. Their own personal history usually isn't the personal history of most Indigenous people. This is the reality for them as individuals, but it's the reality for Canada. When we talk about reconciliation, that's what we're trying to reconcile. How can you do that when you have a country based on denial? When you have provincial and federal governments who continue the policy of denial? Regardless of what you hear in the media, regardless of what you hear from the Prime Minister, regardless of what you hear from the premiers, Indigenous people know this. When they actually go out there and try to exercise their rights, when they make arguments in court to defend their rights, that's when you hear what provincial and federal government's real positions are. Deny, deny, deny. The responsibility is on all of us to let politicians know that has to end. It doesn't reflect your values. It doesn't reflect your community's values. It doesn't reflect the country's values. That has to stop. When we accept this fact of what Canada's been and what it currently is, an opportunity arises. It's an opportunity to move forward in a real way, not based on promises, not based on rhetoric, but based on acceptance and based on recognition. I urge us all, let's embrace that opportunity. Thank you for listening today. Now join me in one of my favorite hymns, Circle Round for Freedom.